joyful to see the life back. And I was just praising God as I was driving around. And but as we were even discussing this morning before the beginning of a worship time, it may have long term effects on the way that the life is going to go, because the worldwide crises, have a way of affecting our daily lives, and sometimes for years to come. And we know those who lived through the world wars can testify the shortages of basic food supplies, and that's not the case this time. There was bombing all through the night, and the nightly blackouts, no power, no water in some of those places, and it was hard in some of those horrible times. And even 9/11, if you remember, and how things have changed, especially as you walk through these security gates, heightened security screening at every airport, even at the large gatherings. And I was in India and walking into the malls that they've recently built, and everywhere this screening, and they were checking through whether I was carrying any bomb or anything like that. And some of these things change the way that we live. And I'm sure COVID 19 is going to impact our life some way and the years to come. And and as we move forward and then see, and then adjust to the new normal kind of lifestyles and life behaviors as we come into, um, and facing these challenges, and how we face these challenges, many more challenges may come, and that's what Bible tells us very clearly. And the whole world is what the Bible calls in birth pains, as the world is going to come to an end. And as we move forward and then face these challenges, particularly the younger generation, my children, and all of us, and how we take life is our decision. And as Peter, 1 Peter 5:6 tells us, when we are humble, when we are willing to humble ourselves before God, and God will lift us up in due time. And humbleness and humility is the key, I think. And as I was meditating and then reflecting on these 8 weeks or 6 weeks or 7 weeks of my life during this lockdown at home, and quite a few lessons that are coming to my mind, and then I want to share some of those with you as we move forward. And particularly as I look at this verse, 1 Peter 5, chapter 5 and verse 6: humble yourself before God and he will lift you up. Humble yourself before God and he will lift you up. And how does this humbleness look like? What is humility looks like? And if you read Colossians chapter 3 verse 12, and Paul tells us that it is something that you put on like clothing. And this morning, Brother Hanukkah was commenting on my shirt, and you put on a colorful shirt, like you put on some shirt or some clothing on your body. And Paul tells us, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved by God, and clothe yourself with compassion. Clothe yourself with compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. This is what God tells us through Paul. Clothe yourself. And it is a decision. This morning, as I was looking through the kind of shirts I have, and I have made a decision and pulled this out and put it on my, it's a purposeful, very voluntary decision that I made this morning. Similarly, Paul urges us to clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And one man that went through how many plagues, interesting plagues, that Moses went through when he was in Egypt, the 10 plagues that he went through in Egypt while he was in Egypt, and he was described in Numbers 12:3 as a very humble man, more humble than anyone in the face of the earth. That is what God tells us about Moses. And he tells us quite a few things about how we take our lives across, whether COVID or no COVID, whether no plague or plague, and we need to face life the way that Moses faced. Humble man, and there was no other humble man more humble than Moses himself. And I want to read the psalm that Moses wrote. Anyone remembers the psalm that Moses wrote? As we turn our Bibles, we turn to the one psalm that Moses wrote. It is Psalm 90. And some scholars argue that even Psalm 91 is of Moses, but we don't know. But as I was reading 90 and 91 together, and it looks like, yeah, maybe Psalm 91 as well. But for sure that we know that Moses wrote Psalm 90, and it is one of the very, very old Psalms, probably the oldest in the whole of the Psalms. And it is one ascribed to Moses having written this particular Psalms. And this is a prayer of Moses, and a psalm about oppressors, and a psalm about the God's eternal nature, particularly contrasted with man's frailty. Who is God? What is God and what is man? And how we contrast human life, human weakness, human limitations, and human frailty with God's magnificent power and the bigness of God, the greatness of God. Amazing psalm, the one that I want to meditate with you this morning. It is coming from the most humble man. And as I was looking back and then reflecting my own life, and the humility and the humbleness is what God is calling for, and how you humble yourself before God, and then He will lift you. I couldn't do anything. I was not in control, and I was just waiting. I was a man in waiting in my own den, in my own bubble, for all these weeks, and I don't know whether it's going to go worse and it's going to go better. And though I have complete total faith in God, but I was facing uncertain days, day after day and day after day and day after day. All I was telling myself is, you're not in control. I'm not in control. I don't know what's going to happen next. And the more I recognized myself that I'm not in control, the more my mind and my life, my heart aligned towards God, who is able to deliver me, who is able to lift me up out of this den and so on. And we will quickly look at the psalm and then get some points. And we could divide the psalm in at least 4 parts. And the first two verses tell us about God and who God is and how big He is. And verses 3 to 6 tell us about us, how frail we are, how fleeting our life is, and how little we are in comparison with God and His bigness and His greatness and His infinity, and our finite lives. And also from verse 7 till 11, we will see God's wrath because of human sin and human rebellion and human transgression, and God's wrath over man's sin. And the final part, starting from verse 12, and a beautiful prayer of Moses for mercy. Prayer of Moses for mercy. Probably Bible scholars tell us, but not particularly sure. Probably this psalm may have been written somewhere around Numbers chapter 12 and 13. You remember the whole of the multitude, millions of people, the Israelites, having been redeemed from Egypt, go and then face Canaan. And now the question in front of them is whether to go in and then take over the land. So they send 12 spies they send 12 spies into that particular land in Numbers 13, a strategic chapter that was the deciding factor for the history of the Israel, whether to go in or go back into the wilderness. And they sent 12 spies into Canaan, and 10 of them, 12 of them returned with the report, and 10 of them say, don't go, we will be dead meat. They're going to kill us, they're going to finish us, they're going to put in pieces. That was the report of the 10. But the 2 spies, they say, forget about it, God is so big and he can do marvelous things, let's go and conquer it and take it, come on, let's go. But majority of them win, and a majority of the people believed the majority report, and so they were filled with fear rather than faith, so they didn't go. And as a result, they had to go back and then spend next 38 years in the wilderness. So probably that was the time Moses wrote this psalm. That is the first point. And the second point, probably the next time that we can place this psalm in the history of the Israelite movement, if you like, probably at the end of Numbers 20. When you come to the Numbers 20, Moses is already old and he was worn out with this people, particularly with their complaints and with their behaviors and so on. And by then, Miriam, his sister, dies, and Aaron, his brother, dies. And Moses is very old, and by then many Israelites, these people, were falling away like dead flies, and there were snake story, all the rest of it. And Moses, probably as a pastor in that, was burying people one after the other, and he was facing the complaints and the murmur and all that people were doing to him and so on. And even Miriam was against him, and the Aaron was against him, and only one that is coming to his rescue time and again is God, and then he was the encouragement. By then he lost his temper, and when God tells him to speak to the rock, he goes and then in desperation he hits it, and then he hears God saying, sorry Moses, you won't be entering into the promised land anymore. Now he burst forth and probably writes this psalm. I don't know. Scholars put this psalm in any one of these places in the Bible, in the history of Israelite nation. But here it is. And in spite of all that he has seen, and in spite of all the rebellion, in spite of all that murmur, in spite of all his personal problems, and in spite of all that he was facing day in and day out, and here he stands up and then says, I'm reading verse 1 from Psalm 90, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And he is telling how big God is. And he probably is going back and then looking at generation after generation. He saw his own sister Miriam dying of leprosy, and Aaron making that golden calf himself, and going after one story after the other, one story after, probably he was thinking about his own parents. Who are the parents? Jochebed and Aram. Can't remember exactly the names. I think those are the names. And I have never seen anyone naming their children after these names. But as going one step behind and then look at the generation after the generation after the generation, maybe he was going into the grandparents and great grandparents and all that. Probably he wouldn't even remember, because they were slaves, no record, no genealogy available for him. But when he was going generation after generation, and he says, you are our dwelling place, you're our fortress, you're our God, you're our security, you're our shelter. In other words, you're our home. And one translator puts it this way: you're a den in the house. You're a den. You're a den. Probably the new translator will come up with a new word: you're a bubble, and we live in you, and you protected us. You're our dwelling place, O Lord, from generation to generation. And as we discuss these things in the school setting, college setting, we talk about generations of people. We know baby boomers and Xers, X generation X, and millennial generation, and now currently they call it Generation Z, and all that. And I was looking at where we put all these generation in the history of time, and probably the baby bloomers are now about 70, 80-year-old people. That generation is passing, and the next generation is Xers, X generation. Probably they're about 50s, my age people. And the other ones are millennial generation, 30-year-old people, that generation. And the Generation Z is the latest below 30 people, Generation Z. And people say all sorts of things as to how to teach to different generations. But one thing that Moses tells us is, you're our dwelling place, generation after generation, generation after generation. You protected us. You have taken care of us. You have been our mighty God, and you have taken us out from problem after problem and crisis after crisis. And you have been our dwelling place. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, even before the mountains were brought forth, or even you had formed the earth and the world and anything like that, even from everlasting to everlasting, before people came into this church setting and then started to call God, before anybody started to call you God, you are God even before anyone was made, even the mountains came into being, and before anything that happened, you are always God. You are eternal, and you are our shelter. You are our power. You are our God. And he is able to magnify God. He is able to look at God in a big picture. And if you want to look at how magnanimous he is and how faithful he is. As I was looking back into particularly the last few weeks, he has been very, very faithful to me and to my family. And he is magnanimous and has kept us, and he blessed us in every possible. He was magnificent. He is great. He is big, and he's above my problems and above my needs, and he is more than anything that I can think of. That's why Paul, writing to Philippians, tells us in chapter 1 verse 20, I will exalt him in his body whether I die or I live. I will magnify him in my body. And how do you magnify someone who is already magnificent? And how will you magnify or make someone big who is already big? God is so great and so huge and so magnificent by very nature. But how do you do that? And how do you magnify in his body? I give you this analogy. When you, the astronomy now tells us that there are big stars out there, probably 1,200 times and 12,000 times bigger than what our sun is. Magnificent stars. And the human eye cannot see. They are already big. They are already unimaginably big and unthinkably great, and so on, as we know about some of the stars. But when we put the telescope and then bring it closer to us, and then when we view it through this telescope, and you say, wow, 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 I didn't imagine something of this magnitude, something of this size, and something of this greatness, and you wouldn't know. So when you look at who's already big and already great, and when you view through your body, through the telescope, and then bring God closer to people around you, particularly when you go through crisis in your life, that is the time people are watching you. And you magnify God at this time, or you crumble in fear of faith. You magnify God. But here is Moses standing crisis after crisis, plague after plague, problem after problem. And he has seen God's faithfulness every morning. Every morning. If you go back to our familiar scripture in Lamentations, your mercies are new every morning. And he has seen God's faithfulness every morning. And he was not looking at the crisis. He was not looking at the pain. He was not looking at the rebellion. He was not looking at his personal self-image. Everyone rebelled against him. Everyone said something to him. There were times that they picked up the stones to kill him. And there were times they were started to plot against this man. And they were telling him on the face, let us go back to Egypt. Oh, amid all those things. And he's saying, Lord, you are our dwelling place. From generation to generation. Lord, we cannot live outside of you. That is the beautiful story. And then move on, and then you will see from verse 3 onward. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past. And like watch in the night, or watch is probably 3 to 4 hours time. A watch is a 3 to 4 hours time. 1,000 years is like a day in your sight. 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night, and you carry them away like in a flood. They are like a sleep. In the morning, they are like grass which grows up. In the morning, it flourishes and grows up, and in the evening, it is cut down and withers. The temporality and the ephemeral nature of man, and properly, beautifully, Moses describes here. Probably when he was talking about the 1,000 years old, and before the flood, you remember people used to live for thousands of years, Methuselah and whatnot, and all the names. And probably he was looking at those people, and when he was, you carry them away like a flood. They are like a sleep. Probably Moses is recollecting the Noah's flood, and he was looking around, and in the morning, particularly in desert conditions, in the morning they are like grass which grows up in the morning, and it flourishes and grows up in the evening. It is cut down and withers. Man is like this, and there is no value, and there is no permanence. And we've got to compare these two portions of the scripture, and then look at the infinite value of God, his infiniteness, and then our finiteness. And God is unlimited, and we are limited by space, limited by time, limited by age, and our abilities are very limited, and God is powerful, and we are frail. And other thing, as I already mentioned, we want to be in control of our lives. We want to take decisions, and that's why we put such a lot of money in the bank account, and as a buffer, as a support. And we want to take control of our lives, and we want to take control of every situation. The moment we lose control over a particular situation, we got into despair, we got into anxiety, we got into worry. How would it happen? What if that happens? What if that happens? So we have all sorts of imaginations flooding into our mind, and that I have seen during this COVID very, very graphically. And the worry, the anxiety, and all that invades us because we are not in control. But Moses tells us very clearly, God is in control, not you or not any one of us. And particularly as we look at last night, my children were watching this superhero movie, and I was wondering why the Hollywood is so fascinated about these superheroes, and they keep on producing movies from this Marvel comic books, one after the other, one after the other, one after the other. You have Superman, you have Spider-Man, you have Iron Man, you have Batman, And these men of superhuman nature come back again and again, and you look back into Greek mythology and bring in some more heroes out of that. And why the Hollywood doesn't have any other original ideas? Why do they go back and then produce superheroes so many times and they are so successful? What is the story? The story is we want superheroes. We want to be in control of the whole thing and then do something with our own power, with our own might, with our own ingenuity, with all these things. That's why we are after superheroes, because we put ourselves into that superhuman situation and then said, I am in control. That is the desire of the human being. But Moses reminds us, we are not. God is. The best thing that you and I can do is to dwell in Him and live in Him. And He tells us that our life is like grass, which grows in the morning and withers by evening. And if you go into verse 9, for all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we will fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days. And quickly I started to think, maybe I shouldn't be numbering my age by years. Actually, look at my age in terms of days. And then I did a quick calculation, and then my age is 20,785 days. And if I boast myself is really strong, good health and whatnot, and if I think that I'm going to live up to 80 years, and I have about 9,000 days more to live, and if it is 70, much less. But this is all just wishful thinking. It could be tomorrow, it could be today, it could be any time. And it's God's prerogative, and I don't have. And Bible tells us it is appointed that every man to die once. But when that appointment comes, no one knows. That's why you don't go into despair. And I'm not trying to be cynical here. But what I'm trying to tell you is, teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days. When we start to count our days in number, if a few things come out very, very clearly. The first thing that happens is we start to turn to God, not to man, because we know, particularly COVID-19 outbreak has exposed the areas of our weakness. The weakness, not your weakness, the weakness that your world that you live in has. You thought we are living in the most advanced nation, and we are living in not in the third world, or we are living in a best world possible. And it proved again and again that we cannot necessarily depend on technology and medical treatments, employers, or the government, and they are not there when you need it most. I was the other day, just got out and then looked at Mount Roskill, very near to me. And if it has to explode, will all the 4 cars that are lying outside my door, will they help? If that mountain had to be active again tonight, and if it starts to blow off all the lava and everything else, would my cars help? These roads, do they help? Yesterday itself, they were unable to contain the traffic that came out after 8 weeks of lockdown. Auckland roads couldn't contain. Will the government and all the infrastructure that we have, will they contain? And COVID-19 for me exposed the weakness of the world that we are living in, and all the trust that we have put in, and all the taxes that we are paying. How long will the government be able to feed everyone here if it had to be locked down for another 10 weeks or 20 weeks? The governments wouldn't. And people already looking at and then talking about lockdown was a bad decision. I mean, international, the worldwide, and so on. There were so many other perspectives. We're not going to go into that. And we, with this lockdown and that shutdowns, we have experienced the deficits and the effects of relying on man-made organizations. So it tells us very, very clearly, listen, the first thing, the moment you started to rely on God, and the first thing that you understand the frailty of the human life and the human systems and the human organizations and the human government, the first thing that you do is turn toward God and lean on God and move on to 91, and you will know 10,000 may fall this side and another 10,000 may this side, but God will. Those who live in the magnificent world, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and He is my fortress, my God, whom I trust, in whom I put my confidence. I don't want to put my confidence in these governments. I don't want to put my confidence in these systems and the rest of it, but I want to put my confidence in the Lord. That would be the first reaction that you will come to. The second reaction that will come to, you don't get into fear or anxiety and all those imaginations and so on, but you will see strength in the Lord. You don't get into live at the mercy of viruses and mercy of social distancing, and then making your bubble strong enough and all these different things. Of course, there you have to do it. I'm not saying that you go out and then do whatever you want. That's not what I want to say. But the dependence on God, that's what I am trying to point out here. And you will also see the importance of the human relationships. And you would shed light on the human. That is humility, part of humility. If you look at Moses' life and his relationship with these people, he never got angry with anyone, and he put up with every one together. But with 4 weeks of lockdown, and people are talking about the tensions in the family. Tensions are high with more couples considering divorce, it seems, and parents at wit's end in home, and schooling and school children are going crazy and so on. And when you look at the relationships and the importance of the relationships and so on, and that's the one thing that's important. Another thing that comes to my mind is suddenly churches have become active and people have become active, and people started to ask questions about God. And suddenly people started to think, oh my goodness, I have to share my faith, and I have to share my life, and I have to share my faithfulness, God's faithfulness in my life. And the brevity of life and the time that we have, and the crisis that we may face day in and day out, motivates us to share our faith in God, our relationship and our faith. And that's the last thing that I want to talk about, is we reevaluate where we store up our treasures. We reevaluate where we store up our treasures, because Bible tells us, Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Examine yourself, says Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 13:5. Examine yourself to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourself. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus in you, unless of course you fail the test? And if you ask the Lord about what you have to do, He guides the humble in what is right and teaches them His way. Psalm 25:9, where you put your treasure. And during COVID-19 particularly, many families have faced separation from the loved ones, and you see the migrated workers trying to go back to their beloved ones from the point of view of relationships. and how the sorrow and the challenges faced by many, many people living away from their family members and so on. And suddenly, all your possessions, all your money, and all the cars, and all the big houses, and all the glitz and glamour, in comparison to choosing a loved one back home. I was so worried about my own sister who is facing this danger day in and day out. No proper equipment, no proper gear, medical gear. And she was going every day morning and staying with those sick people till the end. And he was posted in the very COVID suspects ward. And as she's taking care of all that she had was normal mask that you wear, that you wear when you go to pack and save. Probably this is much better quality rather than the things that they provided in India, and the gloves, couple of gloves. That's all that they had. And I was actually praising God for His safety among us. And as you count your days, and if you look at verse 14, I'm closing. Oh, satisfy us early with your mercy, asking for mercy at this time, that we may rejoice and be glad in all our days. And amid this crisis, one after the other, Moses is asking for mercy and asking for his grace so that he can rejoice. He could rejoice. And he could be joyful in his days. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us, the years in which we have seen evil. Let your work appear to your servant. Even Paul tells, writing to Philippians, from the prison. He was writing this letter from the prison, Philippians, Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. And then he says, rejoice. Again I tell you, rejoice in the Lord. And again I tell you, always rejoice. And rejoice is a command. And those who dwell in the house of the Most High will be able to rejoice, because surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence or any other danger. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart, and you will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, or the bombs that will be shelling in any war situation, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. God's faithfulness will be around us. That's why Moses writes us, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. You have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. And magnifying God in our body, magnifying God through our circumstances, magnifying God through our crisis, because He is the one who is in control. And He redeemed you, and He redeemed me. He restored you, and He is promising you and me eternal life. And I want to read that one verse from Philippians chapter 2. And let the same mind be in you as well. And Jesus Himself humbled Himself so much, and then left all the glory behind. And when He looked at you, and He felt compassion for you, and then here He is, He who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be clinged on to and grasped, but made Himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient to death, even death on cross. God coming to your rescue and my rescue, particularly that biggest of the pestilence that we faced, the sin. And when there was no vaccination for that particular pandemic, when we were all under the wrath of God, as Moses was praying, the wrath of God upon us, and he was taking us away one by one, one by one, one by one. And as he witnessed people falling like flies in the desert, and when he saw his own rebellion, and when he saw the wrath of God. But here is God himself having compassion on you and me and given us Christ, and Christ obediently, humbly, with humility, put away all the robes of divinity and become like one among you, like one of us, walked on this earth and died a death like a criminal. He was numbered among the criminals, the transgressors, and he was made sin, who he did not know no sin, but still he was made sin for you and for me, so that you and I become sinless, you and I become righteous. What a story! What a story! What a story! And his faithfulness and his goodness, the bigness of God, and the kind of God that we serve. And this particular little crisis that I went through taught us all these things that I just wanted to share in the context of Psalm 91, and particularly the compassion of God in Jesus Christ as he came down to save man from his sins and me from my sins, particularly. As we approach the table, as we take the bread and the drink and remember his death until he comes, shall we bow our heads